The fluorescent lights in the lab had never looked so harsh. 2 days had passed since the gantry accident, and my body ached in ways my mind refused to process. But it wasn't the physical pain that kept me awake that night. It was the clarity. I had survived by inches, and in those microseconds hovering between life and death, every memory of the last 2 years replayed like a film I'd never been allowed to see. Simon. His reassurances. His casual excuses for disappearing at odd hours. The subtle, almost imperceptible lies that had piled up like sediment, quietly burying my own instincts and reason. I remembered the late nights he claimed were client emergencies, the odd trips with no receipts, the dismissive comments when I asked questions that mattered. Every rationalization I had made for him, every "he must be stressed, he works so hard," was gone. My fog of trust had lifted, leaving a crystal-clear lens to see the truth. I returned to work that morning like a ghost among my colleagues. My hands moved through the familiar routines, checking schematics, recalibrating sensors, logging maintenance reports, but my mind was elsewhere. I observed, calculated, analyzed. The usual irritation I felt over minor errors seemed insignificant. I was focused on something far larger, far more urgent. Then Simon appeared, smooth as always, a practiced smile glued to his face. "Renata, I have an emergency meeting with the CEO downtown," he said, his voice casual, his eyes slightly nervous. I raised a brow. The last time he had an emergency meeting, the outcome had been a sudden, unexplained cancellation of a crucial project we were leading together. I felt the familiar knot in my stomach, the one I used to dismiss as paranoia, but this time it hardened into certainty. He was lying. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. Instead, I let him leave while I followed, keeping to the shadows, the rhythms of my own body perfectly calibrated to move silently. Each step was deliberate, measured. The city's chaos, honking cars, late-night commuters, neon reflections, was background noise. My focus was absolute. Simon ducked into a discreet valet area, and I kept a safe distance. He handed his car over, then walked swiftly to the entrance of a high-end private dining room in a building I recognized only from corporate charity events and high-stakes networking galas. The kind of place where secrets were exchanged in hushed tones over aged wine and chef-prepared dishes. I pressed myself against the side of a column, ducking into the small shadows. My engineering instincts took over. I spotted a vent along the wall near the private dining room entrance, partially uncovered during renovations. I crouched, my fingers working quickly to manipulate the panel just enough to allow my ear to hover over the opening. Inside, Simon was not alone. Vivian, the CEO's wife, whose reputation for social charm masked a ruthlessness that most executives feared, was speaking, laughing in a way that made my blood run cold. Simon's voice, smooth and practiced, intertwined with hers in a conversation that was intimate in a way no professional dialogue should ever be. I heard the words that crystallized the danger I was in. "It's perfect. We killed two birds, my miserable marriage and your fiancé, who knows too much about your tech." The casual malice in Vivian's tone made me shiver. Not only had Simon betrayed me, but he had also endangered the company and, potentially, my life. I pressed closer, heart hammering, every nerve alight. I knew, without hesitation, what I had to do. There would be no confrontation without preparation, no emotional implosion without strategy. Simon's next moves would be carefully recorded, every document, every plan documented. And I would find the right ally, the one whose integrity matched the stakes of this betrayal. As Simon laughed, unaware of the shadow pressed just beyond the vent, I felt a surge of calm determination. I was no longer the woman distracted by late-night excuses and fading promises. I was awake, fully awake, and I would make sure that every misstep, every treachery, was exposed, with precision, intelligence, and the kind of cold creativity that only comes from seeing your life and love betrayed. And I had the perfect ally in mind. The city at night had a way of magnifying both fear and focus. Lights from nearby skyscrapers reflected off glass facades, painting long streaks across the streets. I moved with the precision of a seasoned engineer, Every step considered, every angle scanned for potential witnesses. The private dining room Simon and Vivian had vanished into was supposed to be a sanctuary of secrecy, but I had an edge they did not. Knowledge of their deception and the clarity of a mind fully awake. I crouched near the vent, the metal cool against my cheek. The muffled murmur of their conversation was punctuated by soft clinks of silverware and the occasional laugh that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated, premeditated. The stakes were higher than I had feared. The merger Simon had been so eager to push through, it wasn't just a corporate maneuver. It was a vehicle for theft, manipulation, and if left unchecked, a professional disaster that could ruin more than just me. Vivian's voice carried clearly despite the muffling. The documents are ready. With this merger finalized, the boutique firm can start moving assets within weeks. No one will suspect a thing. Her tone was almost playful, a cruel delight I hadn't expected. Simon responded smoothly, reassuring, but with a subtle arrogance that made my teeth clench. Don't worry. Everything is in place. Renata won't see it coming. My hand tightened around my notebook, ready to sketch, to record, to map every detail. I had to act like a double agent, but with the precision of someone who had anticipated every potential move. I wasn't going to confront them yet. I needed leverage. I needed Kellan.
Kellan.
I had met him briefly in the office, a colleague of Simon's, known for his impeccable integrity and brilliant, strategic mind. Unlike the rest of our department, he treated rules as non-negotiable, but he had a sharp streak of wit that could cut through deception like a scalpel. If anyone could help me dismantle Simon and Vivian's plan, it was him. And, truthfully, I was already curious about him, about the fire I glimpsed behind his calm, calculating eyes. Simon laughed lightly, the kind of laugh that once would have lulled me into trust. Vivian leaned in, whispering something I couldn't catch, but the malicious undertone was clear. This wasn't about ambition alone. It was about crushing anyone who threatened their plans, and they saw me as nothing more than a threat to be neutralized. I pressed my ear closer, careful not to make a sound. I needed every word, every nuance. My pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a meticulous thrill. My mind traced the flow of assets, the vulnerabilities in Simon's access points, the legal loopholes that could expose Vivian's role. Each sentence they spoke was another thread to unravel, another piece of the puzzle. As they discussed transferring control, I realized I had a choice. Confront Simon head-on, risking exposure and personal danger, or prepare a surgical strike with Kellan's expertise. The answer was obvious. I had no interest in theatrics. Precision and timing were my weapons. Slipping back into the shadows, I exited the building quietly, my notebook filled with every detail I had overheard. The city's night air felt sharp against my skin, and with each breath, I felt the fog of fear dissolve further. Simon and Vivian had underestimated me. I was not the distracted fiancé. I was fully aware, fully prepared, and fully awake. I texted Kellan a brief, coded message. We need to talk. Urgent. I have information you won't believe. I knew he would respond. He always did when the stakes were real, when integrity and strategy were on the line. And I could already feel the electricity of our shared intellect, the unspoken connection that made me respect and, yes, slightly intrigue him. This was just the beginning. Simon thought he could manipulate his way through both our lives. But I was done being manipulated. With Kellan by my side, I would turn their carefully constructed scheme into a map of their own downfall. And perhaps, in the process, I'd find someone who saw me not as a pawn but as a partner, a mind and spirit equally sharp, equally cunning. Tonight, I was no longer the woman afraid of betrayal. Tonight, I was awake. The cafe where I arranged to meet Kellan was almost absurdly ordinary. Small tables, soft jazz in the background, the smell of coffee and pastry wafting through the air. Perfect, I thought. No cameras, no prying colleagues, no Simon or Vivian lurking around. Just me, my notebook, and the man I was about to recruit into my carefully plotted game. I arrived first, settling into a corner booth. My hands were steady now, No tremors from the adrenaline of the past 2 nights. The memory of Simon and Vivian's conversation had left a cold imprint in my mind, but it was clarity more than fear that drove me. I opened my notebook, flipping to the page where I had meticulously sketched their conversation, the timing of the merger, the financial loopholes, and the potential vulnerabilities. Kellan walked in like he owned the air around him, not aggressively, not arrogantly, but with a calm, precise authority. His eyes scanned the room briefly, and then they landed on me. There was an almost imperceptible smile, one that suggested he already understood more than I had said. I felt my pulse tick up, not from fear, but from that curious, unexpected spark that ignited every time our paths crossed. "Renata," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. His voice was low, confident, and measured. "You sounded urgent. I assume this isn't about the quarterly report." I allowed myself a small, controlled smirk.
"No.
It's much more interesting than a quarterly report, and much more dangerous." I laid the notebook on the table, opening it to the first page. I overheard Simon and Vivian discussing a scheme to siphon off funds from the upcoming merger. They've been planning this for months, and the level of detail they put into it, it's not just financial fraud. They see me as a liability, and possibly worse. Kellan leaned in slightly, scanning the notes. His brow furrowed, lips pressed together, his analytical mind clearly ticking. I could feel his gaze on me, and there was something in it, a mixture of respect and admiration. Not for my beauty, not for my charm, but for my intellect and my courage. That made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. "This is serious," he said finally, exhaling slowly. "And if what you're saying checks out, Simon and Vivian won't see it coming. I like your thoroughness, Renata. But we need more than this notebook. We need proof that's indisputable." I nodded, flipping to the page where I had detailed their conversation in the vent outside the dining room. "I have the audio recording. It's rough, but clear enough. They don't know I've been listening. It's our leverage." He reached over, tapping the audio icon on my laptop lightly. This is gold. If we use this correctly, we can dismantle their plan without exposing ourselves." His eyes met mine again, and I caught the slightest flicker of something personal there, something that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I swallowed, careful to maintain my composure. We need to be methodical. Timing is critical. Any misstep, and they could destroy us or bury the evidence. I want to be in control of the fieldwork. I know their patterns, their weaknesses. Kellan's smile widened, subtle but teasing. "I had a feeling you'd say that." "Good. Because I like partners who think fast, act smarter, and aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Especially when the stakes are high." There was a pause, the kind that felt heavier than words. I realized, somewhere between strategy and admiration, that I wasn't just intrigued by his intellect. There was a pull, a subtle, undeniable tension in the space between us. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to focus. This was a partnership born of necessity, yes, but also precision. And perhaps, just perhaps, it could grow into something unexpected. I gathered my notes, closing the laptop slowly. Then we proceed carefully. We gather everything they've tried to hide, exploit their overconfidence, and dismantle this without leaving a trace back to us. He nodded, leaning back, but his hand lingered near mine, almost brushing it. That small touch, accidental or intentional, sent a shiver up my spine. "We make a good team, Renata. I think this is going to be interesting."
"Yes."
Interesting, I thought. Dangerous, yes, but also exhilarating. And beneath it all, I felt the stirrings of something more than strategy, something that neither of us could have planned. Tonight, we weren't just plotting a corporate takedown. We were building trust, intelligence, and perhaps the beginning of a bond that went beyond spreadsheets, blueprints, and betrayal. The office felt different at night, quieter, almost conspiratorial. Normally, I thrived in daylight, when the hum of machinery and distant chatter filled the building. But tonight, under the dim emergency lights and shadows cast by my laptop screen, I felt a predator's focus. Kellan and I had planned every step meticulously, but the reality of executing it sent a thrilling spike of adrenaline through me. I slipped in through the side entrance, a small access card Kellan had procured hanging from my neck. Each beep of the security panel sounded like a drumbeat in my chest. The corridors were empty, the building hushed except for the low mechanical hum of the climate control system. I could almost feel Simon's overconfidence floating in the air. He never suspected that anyone could be both patient and calculated enough to infiltrate his lairs. My first target was the internal server room. I had studied the blueprints for days, memorizing the routes and blind spots. Kellan's instructions had been precise: bypass the secondary locks, access the logs, and extract the evidence without leaving a trace. It was thrilling, methodical, and terrifying all at once. My fingers flew over the keyboard as I tapped into the secured system, using credentials Kellan had sourced. Every alert, every small digital hiccup, made my pulse quicken, but I stayed calm, professional, ice under fire. Halfway through the data extraction, I heard a soft sound behind me, a footstep, precise and deliberate. My heart skipped, and I froze, letting my eyes adjust. Kellan emerged from the shadow of the server racks, moving silently, his presence commanding but somehow comforting. "I thought you might need backup," he said, his voice low, almost a murmur meant just for me. I felt a rush, not fear, not even relief, but an electric awareness of him in the room. Backup or supervision? I teased lightly, though my hands were still steady on the keyboard. He smirked, crouching slightly to hover near the console. "A little of both, but mostly to make sure you don't get into trouble without me." The subtle warmth in his tone made my pulse race, and I caught a flicker of something else. Interest, perhaps, or admiration. I reminded myself this was serious. "Focus, Renata." We worked in tandem, Kellan guiding me through encrypted directories, offering insight into potential traps Simon had built. His proximity was dangerously distracting. I felt the brush of his sleeve against mine, the faint scent of his cologne. Somehow, amid the high-stakes digital infiltration, there was a growing, undeniable tension, a spark neither of us could ignore. The final step required physical access, a drawer in Simon's office containing the actual contract for the merger, the one outlining the siphoning scheme. I glanced at Kellan, silently asking if he'd cover me. He nodded, eyes meeting mine, a silent promise. My fingers hovered over the handle, adrenaline sharpening every sense. I opened the drawer, and there it was, the smoking gun, all neatly typed and signed, just as Simon and Vivian had planned. My stomach clenched, not from fear, but from the rush of finally holding proof of everything. I tucked the documents carefully into my bag. Kellan's hand brushed mine as he moved to step back, and I didn't pull away. That brief, accidental touch sent a shiver through me.
A spark.
He looked at me then, and there was something unspoken between us. A shared exhilaration, a mutual acknowledgement that we were more than just collaborators tonight. "We make a hell of a team," he said quietly, a hint of admiration in his voice. My lips curved, but my mind stayed sharp. "Yes," I agreed, voice low. "But this is just the beginning." We retraced our steps carefully, leaving no trace of our intrusion. The night air outside was crisp and liberating. Kellan walked beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his arm brushing mine. I caught his gaze, and for a moment, just a moment, the seriousness of our mission melted into something personal, something electric and unspoken. Tonight, we weren't just collecting evidence. We were testing boundaries, building trust, and discovering that in this high-stakes game, proximity and adrenaline could ignite more than strategy. They could ignite desire. And as we disappeared into the city's quiet streets, I knew our partnership was becoming something neither of us had expected, yet neither could resist. The city at dawn had a peculiar stillness, a hushed calm that made every step feel magnified. Kellan and I had split briefly after retrieving the merger documents, agreeing to reconvene later at a safe location to analyze the files and plan the next move. I walked alone, my bag heavy with paper and purpose, thinking I had everything under control. I had spent weeks preparing for this, mapping every possible contingency. And yet, I could feel the tight coil of unease forming in my chest. I arrived at my apartment, locked the door behind me, and dropped the documents on the kitchen table. The apartment felt too quiet, almost intrusive, as if it were silently judging me for being involved in such dangerous work. I unpacked my laptop and began scanning the contracts, highlighting inconsistencies and noting the sections Simon had likely assumed no one would notice. My fingers moved quickly, professionally, yet my mind kept flicking back to Kellan. The way his presence had been steady, intense, unshakably calm while I worked. The touch of his arm brushing mine during our escape replayed over and over, sending a warmth through me that had nothing to do with fear or adrenaline. Halfway through my analysis, my phone buzzed. The text was brief and cryptic. "We have a problem. Meet me at the rooftop 20 minutes. K." My pulse spiked. Kellan never sent vague messages unless something had gone wrong. I grabbed the documents, my laptop, and the small bag I always carried for emergencies. The stairs creaked beneath my hurried steps, each one echoing in the empty hall like a warning drum. When I reached the rooftop, Kellan was already there, silhouetted against the rising sun, his expression unusually tense. "What happened?" I asked, voice low but steady. He handed me a small, folded printout. My eyes scanned it quickly. It was a security log. Simon's internal monitoring system had detected a brief, unauthorized access to the server the night before. Someone had noticed the intrusion, leaving a potential trail that could compromise everything. My stomach dropped. All our careful planning, every precaution, now hung on the edge of discovery. Kellan's gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw a hint of vulnerability in his usually composed demeanor. "It's minor," he said, though his tone betrayed him. "We just need to cover it before Simon digs deeper. One misstep, and he could figure out someone's been in his system." My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of the moment. "We'll fix it," I said, trying to sound confident. "We always do." He took a step closer, reducing the space between us. "I trust you, Renata. More than anyone." The words, simple and firm, struck me like a lightning bolt. I felt my breath catch. He wasn't just speaking professionally, there was a personal weight behind the words. For a split second, everything, the danger, the adrenaline, the thrill of exposure, melted into a charged intimacy. I leaned slightly closer, letting my fingers brush against his. "And I trust you." The honesty in my voice, the unspoken acknowledgement of how much we relied on each other, hung in the air like static electricity. We moved quickly, devising a plan to overwrite the log and plant a plausible trail that would make the brief intrusion appear accidental. Every keystroke, every adjustment, was precise, but the tension between us was palpable, a subtle friction that had nothing to do with the technical task at hand. As the final overwrite completed, Kellan's shoulder brushed mine, deliberate this time. My heart skipped. The line between professional and personal was blurring faster than I could control, yet the thrill of both, the work and the connection, was intoxicating. We stepped back, breathing hard, and for a long moment, just looked at each other. "One step closer," I whispered, half to him, half to myself. He smiled, a mixture of relief and something deeper, and I felt the heat of it. "We make a dangerous team," he murmured. My response was a subtle, lingering touch of his hand, and a glance that promised this wasn't just about the mission anymore. We left the rooftop, documents safe, plan intact, but the near miss had shifted something irreversibly. I realized that the more danger we faced, the more we depended on each other, not just for the mission, but for the unspoken, growing connection between us. And in that moment, I understood. This partnership was about to become personal in ways neither of us expected. The city lights blurred beneath me as I drove to the rendezvous point Kellan had specified, a small, nondescript warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. My heart was still pounding from the rooftop encounter, but the adrenaline now had a different quality, a mix of fear, anticipation, and a spark I couldn't ignore. The near miss with the server log had shaken me, but more than that, it had reminded me just how much I needed Kellan in this. both professionally and otherwise. I parked in the shadow of a stack of shipping containers and approached the entrance quietly. Kellan was already there, leaning casually against the wall, though his sharp eyes scanned every movement. As I drew near, he straightened, a flicker of relief crossing his face when he saw me. "Thought you might take the scenic route," he teased lightly, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the seriousness beneath the jest. We slipped inside, the warehouse echoing with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. This place was our temporary command center, a neutral zone far from prying eyes. Kellan laid out the next phase. We needed to access the main server from a secure remote terminal while simultaneously planting false logs that would redirect any scrutiny away from us. Each step had to be flawless. One mistake, and Simon would know someone was tampering. As I worked the keyboard, Kellan hovered nearby, offering quiet guidance. "Shift that access point," he murmured, voice low, brushing against my ear as he leaned over my shoulder. The warmth of his body, the closeness, made it nearly impossible to concentrate. I could feel his breath tickle my neck, and my pulse raced, not from fear, but from the electricity of proximity. "I'm focused," I said, trying to keep my tone professional, but my fingers hesitated as I realized I wasn't just typing lines of code. I was aware of him. Every subtle movement, every shared glance, every accidental brush of his hand was magnified in my mind. He chuckled softly. "I can see that." The sound was intimate, a low hum that made my stomach flutter. He leaned even closer under the pretense of showing me a security oversight, and I could feel the warmth of his chest against my arm. I dared to glance at him, meeting his eyes. In that moment, I realized the tension between us wasn't just from the mission. It was something deeper, charged, and undeniable. The minutes dragged as we navigated the server's labyrinthine defenses. One small misstep, and the entire plan could unravel. My hands flew over the keys with precision, while Kellan's presence was both grounding and electrifying. At one point, he reached over to correct my angle on a cable, and our fingers brushed. I didn't pull away. Instead, a subtle spark passed between us, a silent acknowledgement that this partnership had shifted. Finally, after what felt like hours, the system accepted the new logs, and the false trail was in place. I exhaled, tension leaving my body in a rush. Kellan turned to face me fully, his gaze steady, assessing, yet softer than I'd ever seen. "We did it," he said, the relief in his voice matching mine. I let myself step closer. "We make a good team," I murmured, my voice dropping an octave in the quiet warehouse. The unspoken words between us, trust, intensity, attraction, hung in the air. He smirked, a teasing glint in his eyes. "The best," he replied, and without another word, he leaned in, brushing his lips against mine in a hungry, yet restrained kiss. It was brief but incendiary, a spark igniting a fire neither of us could ignore. I stepped back, my mind reeling from the kiss, from the thrill of the mission, and from the undeniable chemistry that had been simmering between us for weeks. "We should probably finish the debrief," I said, attempting to regain composure, though the warmth of him lingered in every nerve ending. Kellan's smile was soft now, intimate. "Yes, but maybe later, we can continue this conversation." He gestured to the screen, but the unspoken promise between us was clear. In that dangerous, high-stakes environment, the line between professional alliance and personal desire had blurred irrevocably. As we left the warehouse, I realized that our partnership had evolved, no longer just about strategy or revenge. It was about trust, intensity, and the magnetic pull of a connection that neither danger nor distance could diminish. And I, for the first time, was awake not only to betrayal but also to the possibility of something fiercely, dangerously beautiful. The next morning, the city felt sharper somehow, the edges of every building and the hum of traffic carrying a weight I hadn't noticed before. I couldn't shake the sense that Simon was already onto something. My near-miss with his private schemes had rattled him, and I knew he would be vigilant. That meant every move Kellan and I made had to be precise, deliberate, like a game of chess where one misstep could cost everything. Kellan and I met at the same warehouse, our unofficial headquarters. He greeted me with that familiar intensity that always left my chest fluttering, but today, there was something more urgent in his eyes. Simon's team has started asking questions, he said, his tone low, almost conspiratorial. If we aren't careful, he'll know we're onto him. I nodded, already scanning the situation. We had the audio recordings, the schematics, the blueprints, everything needed to dismantle Simon and Vivian's scheme, but now timing was everything. My pulse quickened, not just from the stakes, but from standing close to Kellan. He leaned over the table to point at a network diagram, his hand brushing mine. I felt a jolt where contact was made, and for a brief moment, I let myself linger in the warmth of him. We need to create a diversion, I said, forcing my focus back to strategy. Something that will make Simon think we're one step behind while we set the final trap. Kellan nodded, impressed, his eyes locking with mine. There was a long beat where words weren't necessary. The unspoken trust between us spoke volumes. As we mapped out the plan, he leaned closer under the guise of examining the blueprints. I could feel the heat of his body near mine, smell the faint trace of his cologne, and my breath caught. "Renata," he murmured softly, his lips almost brushing my ear. "I've got your back, every step of the way." The intensity in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain professionalism, but the magnetic pull between us was impossible to ignore. We moved like shadows that night, infiltrating Simon's office under the cover of darkness. Kellan was calm, methodical, and I matched his precision, our movements perfectly synchronized. At one point, we crouched behind the same server cabinet, and our knees brushed. His hand found mine instinctively, fingers intertwining for a fleeting moment, grounding me amidst the chaos. I caught his eye, and he gave me a small, knowing smirk, half reassurance, half challenge. The tension between us was unbearable and electric. Every glance, every touch, carried an unspoken question. How far were we willing to let this connection go while the danger loomed around us? I felt his warmth press closer as we navigated the final obstacle in Simon's digital defenses. "Almost there," he whispered, his voice low, vibrating against my skin. I nodded, feeling a thrill that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Finally, we planted the last piece of evidence, redirecting Simon's attention and creating a digital smokescreen that would buy us critical time. I exhaled, exhausted but exhilarated, and turned to face Kellan. His expression was unreadable for a moment, then softened as he stepped closer. The danger had only heightened the intensity between us, and in that shared victory, we couldn't resist the pull any longer. He leaned in, cupping my face gently, and kissed me. It was a hungry, urgent kiss, full of relief, desire, and the promise of something more. My hands instinctively found their way to his chest, holding him close, feeling the steady strength beneath the surface. The world outside, the threat, the schemes, the dangers, faded for that heartbeat, leaving only the two of us. When we finally pulled away, breathing heavy, his forehead rested against mine. "This is just the beginning," he murmured, "for both the plan and us." I nodded, knowing he was right. Trust, strategy, and undeniable attraction had merged into a bond stronger than any fear or betrayal. And for the first time since the accident, I felt fully alive, fully awake, and ready for whatever came next. The morning air had a crisp clarity, almost symbolic, as Kellan and I stepped out of the warehouse, evidence secured and contingency plans executed. Simon's scheme was now exposed, his web of deceit laid bare with irrefutable proof, and I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of what we'd accomplished. For 2 years, I had been sleepwalking through a relationship built on manipulation, excuses, and control. But now, with Simon's threat neutralized, I felt an unfamiliar and exhilarating freedom. Kellan's presence beside me was steady, grounding. He had been my partner in every sense, strategic, fearless, and unwaveringly loyal. I could see the satisfaction in his expression, tempered by the same intensity that had drawn me to him from the start. "It's done," he said, voice low but firm, And nobody walks away from this unscathed but us. Well, maybe a little scarred. I chuckled softly, the sound strange after so long of suppressed tension and anxiety. Scarred but awake, I corrected, feeling the truth in the words. My gaze drifted toward him, noticing the way his eyes softened. Just for me. And I couldn't have done this without you. The words were honest, unguarded, and they seemed to touch something deep within both of us. We moved to the final confrontation point, Simon's office. Security had been tipped, law enforcement quietly waiting for the digital and financial evidence to be presented. The moment Simon realized how fully we had anticipated every move, every lie, was the moment he understood just how exposed he truly was. Watching him crumble, stripped of the facade he had so carefully maintained, was a mix of satisfaction and grim acknowledgement of how close I had come to being trapped forever in his manipulative games. After the legal and corporate chaos subsided, Kellan and I left the office building together, walking through the city streets as the sun dipped below the horizon. The world seemed sharper, brighter, and alive in a way it hadn't for me in years. With every step, I felt layers of fear, manipulation, and doubt falling away. I was no longer a passive observer in my life. I was the strategist, the actor, the author of my own story. Kellan's hand found mine effortlessly, fingers entwining, and I felt a thrill of warmth and intimacy. "We make a good team," he murmured, brushing his thumb over my knuckles in that careful, deliberate way that had me catching my breath every time. I tilted my head toward him, unable to resist the draw between us any longer. "The best," I replied, voice steady yet soft, the words carrying more than just professional affirmation. They were personal, raw, and true. He pulled me close, and the world narrowed until there was nothing but the two of us. His lips met mine in a kiss that was patient yet demanding, tender yet consuming, an affirmation of trust, desire, and something far deeper than either of us had allowed ourselves before. I felt the heat of his hands at my waist, the careful precision of his touch, and I knew that we had moved from partners in strategy to partners in life. When we finally parted, I rested my forehead against his, savoring the silence and the sense of completeness. "What now?" I asked, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Now," he said, his lips curving in a rare, genuine smile. "Now we live. We plan nothing but the life we want, together. And we make sure nobody else writes our story for us." I nodded, feeling a serenity I hadn't known I deserved. The betrayal, the near-death experience, the schemes, all of it had led me here, alert, alive, and fiercely in control. I squeezed Kellan's hand, knowing that for the first time, I didn't just survive, I thrived. As we walked back toward the city lights, fingers intertwined and hearts aligned, I realized that sometimes the most profound rebirths are forged in fire, fear, and the unwavering trust of someone who sees you, not the mask, not the fears, but the real you. And in Kellan, I had found both my strategic ally and my greatest passion. The future was ours to define, together, and I was ready for it.